In the middle of the 20th century, oppression and racism were challenged by courage.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy.
Leadership.
Negroes want complete equality, social, economic, and political.
And a dream.
We as a people will get to the promised land.
A crusade that galvanized a people. It unfolded in the courts and exploded on the streets. The demand for freedom and equality promised to unite the nation and threatened to tear it apart. It was the long, dramatic struggle of the Civil Rights Movement. In all of America's history, no war has been as divisive, as bitterly fought, or as costly as the American Civil War. The question of slavery, above all others, defined the conflict between the Union North and Confederate South. Through 4 long years, men fought and died to determine the future of slavery and the fate of the Union itself. President Lincoln declared that on New Year's Day, 1863, all persons held as slaves within any rebellious state shall be thenceforward and forever free. Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation did not end slavery everywhere, but it marked a turning point in the war. Thereafter, every advance was a step toward Union victory and freedom for all who were enslaved. That victory came on April 9, 1865, when Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant accepted the surrender of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. 5 days later, John Wilkes Booth assassinated President Lincoln. The man who had fought so passionately to preserve the Union would not live to help bind up its wounds. That task would prove to be nearly insurmountable. The Civil War had ravaged the South. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta were literally reduced to rubble. And while buildings and bridges would rise again, the ideas and institutions of the Old South would not. The last will and testament of a Confederate officer named John Sargent Wise exposed the anxiety that plagued many Southerners.
And now, having experienced a death to Confederate ideas and a new birth unto allegiance to the Union, I depart. I see what has been pulled down very clearly. What is to be built up in its place, I know not. It is a mystery.
What had been pulled down was a way of life, built on the bondage and exploitation of others. But following Union victory, during what is known as the Reconstruction era, 3 new amendments to the U.S. Constitution extended to former slaves the blessings of liberty: freedom, citizenship, the right to due process and equal protection under the law, and the right to vote. Pennsylvania Congressman Thaddeus Stevens feared that laws alone would be inadequate.
The infernal laws of slavery have prevented them from acquiring an education, understanding the common laws of contract, or of managing the ordinary business of life. If we leave them to the legislation of their late masters, we had better have left them in bondage.
The concern was prescient. For die-hard Confederates, Reconstruction and racial integration were bitter pills. Through intimidation and terror, they sought to redeem what had been lost on the battlefield. Seething resentment toward northern invaders fueled the growth of vigilante groups like the Ku Klux Klan or KKK. Clad in white robes and bearing torches, Klan posses terrorized the South. One former slave recalled a Klan lynching.
I never will forget when they hung Cy Guy. They comed after him 100 strong. They ties him there in the woods, and with that blood they writes that he shall hang between the heavens and the earth till he is dead, dead, dead. Well, sir, the next morning there he hung, swinging in the wind.
By 1877, Reconstruction had succumbed to bitter opposition and backroom politics. Federal troops then occupying the South were withdrawn, and white supremacists were left to reestablish the racial hierarchy that had existed before the war. Across the former Confederacy, informal practices of racial discrimination were written into law. States instituted poll taxes, literacy tests, and other requirements that disenfranchised Negroes. They passed Jim Crow laws, which imposed segregation and other restrictions on blacks. A few blacks challenged the system of legal discrimination. In New Orleans, a man named Homer Plessy deliberately defied the Louisiana state law requiring separate rail cars for blacks and whites. He was arrested and jailed. But the incident led eventually to the Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy argued that the law infringed on his 14th Amendment right to equal protection. But the majority of justices disagreed. The court's opinion read in part,
Legislation is powerless to eradicate racial instincts or to abolish distinctions based upon physical differences. If one race be inferior to the other socially, the Constitution of the United States cannot put them upon the same plane.
The court affirmed that segregation was constitutional as long as accommodations were separate but equal. It also left it up to the individual states, not the federal government, to guarantee equal standards. As the lone dissenting opinion, Justice John Marshall Harlan wrote,
The thin disguise of equal accommodations will not mislead anyone, nor atone for the wrong this day done.
Plessy versus Ferguson became a landmark decision. It sanctioned a system of institutionalized racism that would persist for decades, one that would require a second period of Reconstruction to overcome.